My name is Marlene Givens. I'm 63 years old. People usually describe me as steady someone who folds her laundry the same day, remembers birthdays, and keeps the house smelling faintly of lemon oil. After Harold died 2 years ago, steadiness was the only thing that kept me from collapsing. Our apartment on Habersham Street isn't large, but it holds the life we built together 40 years of it. Harold hung every curtain rod himself, patched every crack in the wall, and left his toolbox in the closet because a home always needs fixing. Some mornings, I still hear the echo of his radio from the kitchen, playing old country songs while he brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint. That afternoon, the Savannah heat clung to the windows. I was teaching Mrs. Layton how to hem a skirt when the doorbell rang. Through the lace curtain, I saw my son Evan and his wife Kara standing on the porch, both smiling too brightly. I hadn't expected them on a Wednesday. Kara stepped inside first, her perfume chasing away the scent of thread and starch. "The place looks cozy," she said, scanning the living room like an appraiser. Evan gave a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They sat at the small kitchen table where Harold once read his newspaper. Kara rested her manicured hands on the wood. "We've been looking at houses," she began. "Something bigger, closer to downtown. But you know how prices are." I poured sweet tea, trying to ignore the nervous twist in my stomach. "Well, I'm sure you'll find something nice," I said. Kara exchanged a quick glance with Evan. "Actually, this apartment would be perfect for us once the baby comes," Kara said, not realizing how her words assumed control of something that wasn't hers. "It's on the first floor, close to the hospital, and you could move somewhere quieter, maybe near the water." The tea pitcher wobbled in my hand. I set it down carefully. "This is still my home," I said softly. "Of course," she replied, smiling again too quick, too smooth. "We're just thinking ahead." They left a short while later, the air they'd stirred still unsettled. I stood by the window long after their car disappeared, the evening light spilling across Harold's old chair. For the first time in months, the apartment felt smaller, not from space, but from something closing in I couldn't yet name. By Sunday evening, the memory of that awkward visit had begun to fade, or maybe I just forced it to. When Evan called to invite me to dinner at Kara's parents' house, I told myself it was a chance to smooth things over. The Reeds lived in one of those new developments north of the city, where every house looked freshly painted and a little too proud of itself. Kara greeted me at the door with her usual brightness, a kind of warmth that always seemed rehearsed. "Mom, you look lovely," she said, her tone hovering between compliment and performance. Inside, the dining room glowed with soft light. Patrice Reed wore pearls and a floral blouse. Her husband Ronald poured wine like a man used to being listened to. "Such a charming apartment you have," Patrice began as we sat down. "Evan told us it's in one of those historic buildings downtown. All that character, though. I can't imagine the maintenance." Kara laughed, glancing at Evan. "It's adorable, but tiny. Mom's always been sentimental about old things." I smiled politely, folding my napkin in half. "Old things have stories," I said. Ronald leaned back. "Stories are lovely, but they don't cover bills," he quipped, and everyone laughed except Evan. The meal carried on roast chicken, polite conversation, and a steady drizzle of remarks about downsizing, safety at your age, and fresh starts. Patrice mentioned a retirement complex near Tybee Island where people your generation thrive. I sipped my water, each word tightening something behind my ribs. When dessert came, Kara reached for the pie and said with a smile, "You know, that apartment could really work for us once the baby's here. We'd take good care of it." The table went still. Evan's fork paused midair. My throat tightened, but I managed a small nod. "I'm sure you would," I said, my voice even. Ronald chuckled. See, everyone wins. The laughter returned soft. Practiced. Cutting. I set my napkin on the table and stood, pretending to check my watch. Thank you for dinner, I said. I should be heading home before it gets too dark. Kara looked surprised, maybe even disappointed that I didn't argue. But I wasn't angry, just hollow. The night air outside felt cooler than it should have. The kind that slips quietly into your bones and stays there. 3 days after that dinner, I heard Evan's car pull into the driveway. I was mending a torn hem for one of my students and nearly dropped the needle when the knock came. He never visited without calling first. Hey, Mom, he said as I opened the door. He looked tired, eyes rimmed red like he hadn't slept. In his hand was a folder, thick with papers. Everything all right, I asked. Yeah, he said too quickly. Can we talk for a minute? We sat at the kitchen table, the one with the faint water ring Harold always meant to sand out. Evan slid the folder toward me. It's just some paperwork Dad never finalized. Something about the apartment's title. Kara's been helping me get everything organized, to make sure things are handled properly. The folder felt heavy, colder than paper should. I flipped through the pages and saw words I didn't recognize: transfer of ownership, joint occupancy, spousal rights. My pulse started to hum in my ears. Handled properly. I repeated. For who Evan hesitated, Kara talked to a friend who's a real estate agent. She said the apartment might still technically be part of Dad's marital estate. If you signed this, it would just clarify things. I finished for him. He nodded. His shoulders tense. Yeah, clarify. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the river. The sound felt sharp. Too close. I pushed the papers back toward him. I'll need to look these over, I said. He exhaled, half relief, half guilt. Sure, of course. No rush. Kara just thought I know what Kara thought, I said, softer than I felt. After he left, I sat for a long time at that table, the folder in front of me like a wound I didn't dare touch. Finally, I picked up the phone and called Carlton Hayes, Harold's old attorney. His voice was slower now, older, but still steady. Marlene, he said, after listening to my halting explanation. You're the sole owner. The deed was updated the year before Harold passed. No one can change that without your consent. When I hung up, I rested my hand on the folder and felt something shift inside me. Something fragile and final. I folded the papers neatly, tucked them into a drawer, and poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. The house was silent again, but the silence no longer felt safe. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Warm and quiet. The kind of morning that smelled faintly of rain and laundry soap. I had just finished hanging a few blouses on the line when I noticed a folded piece of paper taped to my door. At first, I thought it was a flyer or a delivery notice. But when I stepped closer, my breath caught. Across the top, in bold letters. It read, eviction notice. The rest blurred for a moment. Words swimming into nonsense tenant. Vacate. 30 days. At the bottom was Kara's signature. Printed neat and cold. I pressed my hand to the doorframe to steady myself. By the time Evan arrived that evening, I had read the paper a dozen times. He stood in the doorway, avoiding my eyes. Mom, it's not what it looks like, he said, voice low. Kara just filed something to protect us legally. It's a misunderstanding. I held the notice up between us. A misunderstanding that has my name on it, I said. He rubbed the back of his neck. She didn't mean it like that. They just thought filing the notice would help clarify the paperwork without realizing it would upset you. Paperwork. I laughed then, though it didn't sound like me. Speed what along? Evan pushing me out. His shoulders sagged. It's complicated. Not really, I said. It's cruel. He opened his mouth to answer but couldn't. For a second, he looked like the boy who used to fix the porch light with his father Ernest. careful, sure of right and wrong. Then he left without another word. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Harold's photograph in my hands. The lamplight made his smile look younger than I remembered. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb. "You promised this would always be ours," I whispered. The apartment creaked softly around me, the way it did on humid nights. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the river. I didn't cry. I just sat there, waiting for the sound to fade, and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The next morning, I folded the eviction notice and slipped it into a drawer beneath Harold's old tool receipts. I wasn't going to tear it up or frame it like proof of betrayal. I just needed it where I could see it when doubt crept in. I called Mr. Hayes first. His office hadn't changed in years, same oak desk. Same smell of old paper and coffee. He looked at me over his glasses, his expression both kind and resigned. "I've already reviewed the records," he said. "Your ownership is airtight, Marlene. But if they try anything else, we'll make sure the court knows." He helped me sign a reaffirmation of title, stamped and notarized before noon. When I walked out into the Savannah sun, the air felt heavier but cleaner somehow, like I'd exhaled something I'd been holding for weeks. From there, I went to the hardware store on Abercorn Street. The young clerk looked surprised when I asked for new locks and a motion light for the porch. "You need help installing those." "Ma'am?" he asked. "No," I said, smiling faintly. "I've got a toolbox and 2 good hands." By evening, I'd replaced the locks myself, the sound of the screwdriver turning steady and sure in the quiet apartment. I double-checked the windows, the doors, even the old latch on the balcony. Then I called the local precinct and filed a report for harassment, just in case. Officer Lynn Ortiz took my statement with calm professionalism. "If they show up again, you call me directly," she said, handing me her card. When night fell, I turned on the new porch light. The glow spilled over the steps, warm and soft against the darkness. I stood there a long while, listening to the cicadas hum, remembering how Harold used to say a porch light was a promise that someone inside was waiting, that home was safe. This light, I thought, wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about warning. And for the first time since all this began, I felt steady again, not because I trusted them, but because I finally trusted myself. The pounding started before sunrise. At first, I thought it was thunder rolling across the river again. But then came the second blow, louder, sharper, close enough to rattle the dishes in the cabinet. I slipped on my robe and walked toward the front door. Through the narrow window beside it, I saw movement shadows against the porch light I'd left on. Then Kara's voice split the morning air. Kara's voice trembled with panic and anger. She'd already stormed up the street and yelled at neighbors, thinking she had no other way to assert her claim. "Break down the door. This is my husband's apartment." She was standing at the bottom of the steps in a silk robe and sneakers, her hair a tangle of fury. Behind her, Ronald Reed gripped a crowbar. Patrice was shouting orders. And Evan stood on the walkway, pale and still. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. The Reeds' respectable people with their manicured lawns and dinner parties looked like looters in the half-light. I didn't move closer. I simply reached for the phone, already programmed with Officer Ortiz's number. My voice was calm when she answered. "They're here," I said, "just like we thought." While I waited, I listened to Kara's rage spill across the yard. "She's hiding behind that door like a coward. This is ours." Her mother hissed something I couldn't make out. Evan tried to speak, but Kara cut him off. The first hit from the crowbar struck the railing instead of the lock. Wood splintered. The sound sharp enough to sting. I stood perfectly still, one hand resting on Harold's old toolbox by the door. Then, from down the street, the low hum of a patrol car grew louder. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, painting the walls blue and white. Kara froze mid-shout. Ronald dropped the crowbar to his side. I took one slow breath and unlocked the door not to surrender, but to face them on my own terms. The morning light had just begun to slide across the porch when I turned the lock. The hinges groaned softly, the way they always did, and for a second, everything was still. No shouting, no hammering, just the sound of breath hanging in the cool air. Kara stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, her hand half raised as if she meant to strike again. Her parents were beside her, Ronald clutching the crowbar awkwardly now, Patrice clutching her pearls like a prayer bead. Evan stood behind them, shoulders hunched, eyes on the ground, frozen in the tension of loyalty and fear, unsure whether to support his wife or his mother. I opened the door wide, and there, just behind me, stood Officer Ortiz and Mr. Hayes. They had arrived seconds before, quiet as dawn itself. Ortiz's presence filled the small porch, calm but firm, one hand resting lightly on her belt. Mr. Hayes held a folder under his arm, his glasses fogged from the morning humidity. "Morning? Mrs. Givens," he said gently. "I believe this is what you asked for." He opened the folder, lifted the top document, and faced the group on the steps. His voice was clear, practiced, and unshakable. "This property belongs to Mrs. Marlene Givens. Sole ownership, confirmed and registered. Any attempt to enter without her consent constitutes trespassing." Kara blinked as if she hadn't heard him right. "That can't be," Evan said. "Evan said nothing of the sort," Mr. Hayes interrupted quietly. "I've reviewed every file myself." Patrice turned toward her son-in-law, her tone rising in disbelief. "You told us this was your father's estate." Evan's face was pale. I thought Officer Ortiz stepped forward. "You need to leave the property now," she said, "or I'll have to record this as an attempted break-in." No one spoke. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause. Ronald lowered the crowbar slowly until it touched the porch floor. Kara's breath came out in a shaky exhale, her defiance collapsing into something smaller, almost fragile. I stood there, the morning air brushing against my face, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel cornered. I didn't yell, didn't gloat, didn't even look away. I simply stood where I belonged, on the threshold of my own home, while the truth did the talking for me. Chapter 8. The Fallout Officer. Ortiz wrote the warning with slow, deliberate strokes. The scratch of her pen, the only sound breaking the heavy morning stillness. Kara stood off to the side, arms crossed, her face pale and tight. Patrice dabbed her eyes with a trembling hand, while Ronald stared at the porch floor, the crowbar now hanging loosely at his side. When the officer finished, she handed the slip to Ronald. "Any further attempt to enter this property without consent will lead to arrest," she said evenly. No anger, just certainty. Mr. Hayes gave me a small nod before leaving. "You handled it with grace, Marlene," he said quietly, the file still tucked beneath his arm. Evan bent to gather the papers his wife had dropped, his hands shaking. Kara grabbed her purse and brushed past him, heels clattering down the steps. Patrice followed, whispering something about disgrace. Ronald lingered a moment, then placed the crowbar against the railing like an unspoken apology before walking away. Only Evan remained. He met my eyes, guilt heavy in his voice. "I never wanted it to go this far." "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure if I did. When he left, the silence returned, soft but hollow, inside. I set the teapot on the stove, then noticed a yellowed envelope tucked between two cookbooks, Harold's handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. One line read, "Never let them take what we built. Mar." I pressed the note to my heart, feeling both its weight and its promise. The memory of the driveway confrontation lingered, but I chose to let the past remain outside as she stepped onto the porch. 2 days later, I heard a soft knock on the door just after sunset. The porch light cast a thin glow across the steps, and when I opened the door, Evan stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders heavy. He looked older than he had the week before, like the last few days had carved something permanent into his face. I didn't know it would go that far, he said quietly. I thought Kara just wanted to talk to you. I never meant for it to become that. I stepped aside but didn't invite him in. Some things, once done, don't go back, I said. He nodded, eyes glistening. I just wanted peace, he whispered. Peace isn't inherited, Evan, I said. It's earned. For a moment, the only sound was the porch light buzzing faintly between us. I wanted to reach for him the way I used to pull him close, tell him we'd start over, but that kind of comfort belonged to another time. He wiped at his face and nodded again. I understand. When he walked away, I watched until his shadow disappeared down the street, then closed the door gently. The light stayed on behind me, steady and warm, like something choosing to remain. Weeks passed, and the apartment began to sound like itself again. The hum of my old sewing machine, the quiet chatter of my students, the laughter that filled the corners Harold once painted himself. The scent of fabric and starch returned, warm and familiar, as if the walls had decided to breathe again. One Friday afternoon, the women from my sewing group brought homemade biscuits and sweet tea. We worked by the open window, gossiping about summer fairs and grandkids. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. When evening came, I walked to the porch and turned on the light. Harold wired years ago. It flickered once before glowing steady, spreading a soft gold across the steps and the hydrangeas that had somehow survived the season. I stood there, listening to the city settle into twilight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Evan. Thank you for teaching me how to stand on my own. The message read a recognition of lessons learned, not just words. I smiled, tucking the phone away. The light shone quietly over Habersham Street. Neither a signal nor a warning this time, but something simpler, a promise that peace, once found, could stay.